Having dispatched Singer with their argument about the nature of personal identity, George and Lee now turn their attention to dispatching the other pro choice positions. And I think what we're going to be covering now, it's really, for our purposes, it's really going to be the kind of heart of their position. It's going to reveal the most about what they actually think about the ethics of abortion. The argument against Singer reveals more about their views on the philosophy of mind than it really does on the ethics of abortion. And so it's not really central to our concerns. What they're going to say here, and then in the next video, their reply to Thompson, this really contains their views on the ethics of abortion. So the way they proceed is by casting their argument as being against kind of other pro-choice positions. And they consider a particular kind of pro-choice position. So let's put our timeline of development back up there. The particular kind of pro-choice position that they are now going to consider and argue against has the following features, right? It's going to hold that you are a physical organism, right? So you started off as that single-celled embryo way back at conception, right? So this is a difference between the position now under consideration, the pro-choice position now under consideration, and then Singer's position, according to George and Lee. According to George and Lee, Singer wouldn't admit that. He wouldn't say that you are a physical organism, whatever, right? The pro-choice position now under consideration, however, will say, yes, you came into existence at conception, sure, fine, but you are not essentially a person. Which is to say, you can have the property of personhood, but you can also lose it. And you're still you. You may not have begun with it, and you acquired it sometime later, and you might lose it at some time later than that. Personhood is it's kind of like, I don't know, what would an example of it be? Like having long hair. You didn't start off with long hair, but then you came to have long hair, but then you chopped it all off and now you don't have long hair, right? Having long hair is not an essential characteristic or property of you. You are you, whether or not you have long hair, right? The pro-choice position under consideration now holds that personhood is like having long hair. It's a kind of thing that you can acquire and lose. You're still you. You don't essentially have that property, though. You don't essentially have long hair. You aren't essentially a person. So fine, you come to exist at conception, but you become a person at some later stage, right? So you're there all along. You're a single-celled organism, and then that multiply, blah, 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 blah. And some point in the development, you become a person. That's the position under consideration now. Now, there are lots of different kinds of pro-choice positions that will fall under this general position, right? Because all this general position, which George and Lee are going to criticize, all this general position holds is that you become a person at some later point. Any pro-choice position that says you become a position at some point after conception, sometime later, George and Lee thinks they have the argument to show that that's incorrect, and that's what they're going to give us, right? So if somebody says, fine, yeah, you come to exist at conception, but you only become a person with rights and so on at viability, that would be a variant of the position under consideration. If somebody said, no, viability, that's ridiculous, just because someone's dependent and blah, 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 right? I don't buy any of that stuff. You only become a person once you're outside of your mother's body. So at birth, that's when okay, that would be another variant on the position. And really, even I kind of think even Singer's position is a variant on this. George and Lee don't think so. It's kind of confusing. But I think even Singer's position is best understood as a kind of variant on the position under consideration now, because Singer wants to say you become a person, or maybe the thing becomes a person at 1 month, right? That's Singer's position. When the baby is self-aware. See, the baby you have out there, that's not a self-aware baby. That's a just born baby. That baby's not thinking about itself. It's not thinking about anything, right? So Singer would say that baby right there, that's not a person. But you give that baby a month, then you got a person on your hands, right? That's Singer's position. So at some later point, okay, so all kinds of pro-choice positions are going to fall under this, under what George and Lee are considering now, right? The way they put it, according to this position, to all the varieties of this position, right? So according to this position, to be a person, to have rights, in particular, have a right to life, it's not enough to be human. The embryo is human. The 2-celled thing is human. The 4-cell, blah, 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 right? It's always human. But it's not a person according to this position, right? So it's not sufficient to be a person to be human. There are humans that aren't persons. And this idea, again, should be familiar from Singer. This is something like what Singer had said. So you need something in addition to being a human. So in addition to being a human being, you need some other trait or characteristic. You need to be developed in some particular way. You need to have some property or feature or characteristic. And, various pro-choice people who fall under this kind of heading, who hold this position, they might disagree about what that further characteristic is. That's fine. That's okay. But what holds all those positions in common is that they hold you need some additional characteristic in order to be a person. Yeah. Well, now the crucial question is, what is that additional trait or behavior or feature? What do you need in addition to being a human being in order to be a person? What is it that makes a human into a person? That's the question George and Lee are asking. All right, so let's consider that now. Move me over there. What is that additional trait or behavior or feature that a human being needs in order to become a person? And it would also be the case that if they lost that additional trait or behavior, they'd cease being a person. So what is that? Well, the way George and Lee proceed is by claiming that it's either got to be some actual behavior or some potential behavior. It's got to be one or the other. Those are kind of exhaustive. It's got to be one or the other. It's got to be some actual behavior or some potential behavior. For just a really quick illustration of what that might mean, right? So right now you are actually watching this video. That's an actual behavior that you are engaging in. But let's say in 5 hours you're not, right? In 5 hours you're eating or taking a nap or staring at the wall. You could, however, be potentially watching the video. You're not, but you have the potential to watch the video. That's a kind of potential behavior, right? You could watch it. Okay, so that's the distinction. Easy enough, intuitive enough. It's got to be either some actual behavior that makes us a person or some potential for some behavior that makes us a person, that makes a human being into a person. Well, George and Lee argue, it can't be some actual behavior. Now, what they begin considering at this point is a particular kind of behavior, because what proponents of the pro-choice position under consideration typically want to say is that it's something about higher mental functioning that makes a human being into a person. higher or advanced mental functioning makes something a person. And again, this idea should be familiar to us from Singer. This is exactly what Singer had said, right? And so when they talk about actual behavior and potential behavior, George and Lee are going to start focusing in on actual higher mental functioning or potential for higher mental functioning, right? Okay, and so what they're going to argue now is that it can't be actual higher mental functioning that makes us a human being. That is to say, it can't be actually doing calculus right now, right? So if you stop watching the video and you start doing calculus, that's not what makes you a human being. It's not actually engaging in that kind of advanced mental functioning. And what George and Lee argue is that if it were, let's say what made you into a person was actually engaging in self-consciousness, being aware of yourself, or even just something like being conscious or aware of yourself, that kind, even if it's something like that, that kind of advanced mental functioning. If that were what made you a person, actually having awareness of yourself, well, then as soon as you stopped having that kind of self-awareness, you would no longer be a person. You would no longer have rights. And so it would follow, it would be permissible to kill you, right? If actually thinking about yourself as a self were what made you into a person, well, then as soon as you kind of just dozed off and whatever, right? Just zoned out, well, you would lose your rights. But that's absurd. Yeah. Even if you zone out, you still have rights. You're still a person. And you can give other kinds of examples, right? So what I have up there on the screen for you, say you fall into a reversible coma or you're knocked unconscious momentarily. Well, there's no advanced mental functioning actually going on, right? It's just blank, right? You're in a coma, you're unconscious. There's no actual advanced mental functioning. And so if it were actual advanced mental functioning that made you a person, when you fell into a coma or you were knocked unconscious, you would no longer be a person. And if you were no longer a person, it would be permissible to kill you. But that's absurd. It's not okay to kill people who are momentarily unconscious or who are dreamlessly sleeping, right? Who are sleeping with, I don't know if that's actually, I don't know how it works. I don't know how dreams and sleeping work, but assume someone sleeps without dreaming. You can't just go kill them, right? They're still persons. That's George and Lee's argument here, right? So it can't be it can't be actual advanced mental functioning that makes us persons. Well, okay, trust you can see where this is going. If it can't be some actual behavior, some actual advanced mental functioning or whatever, well, then perhaps it's some potential behavior. Things get a little trickier at this point because George and Lee want to say, well, look, there are at least two senses of potential behavior. When we talk about potential behavior or having the potential to engage in some kind of behavior, there are at least two different things that we might mean by that. And the way they put this distinction, we might mean an immediately exercisable potential for some behavior, or we might mean a natural potential to develop oneself to perform some behavior eventually. Take those in turn. Let me say a little bit more about them. An immediately exercisable potential for some behavior. That would be something like the following. It's something that you're not doing right now, but you could do it if you wanted to, right? So, or more or less, you have all the capacities in place and you could more or less immediately do it if you wanted to, right? So, for example, I assume, well, perhaps I'm wrong, I'm not sure. I assume you are not right now screaming, would you like to buy a monkey? But if you wanted to, you very easily could. Yeah. You have an immediately exercisable potential to do that. Yeah, something like that. You could do it right now if you want to. You're not, but you could. By contrast, when we talk about the potential to perform some behavior, we might not mean something so immediate. We might mean something like the following. A 3-month-old human baby, we might say, has the potential to scream, "Would you like to buy a monkey?" That's right. We might say you have the potential to scream that, and we might say a 3-month-old baby has the potential to scream that. But when we say those things, we mean different things. When we say that you have a potential to scream that, we mean you could do it right now. You have an immediately exercisable potential. You could just right now start screaming that. But when we say that a baby could potentially scream that, we mean something different. We mean that if given time to develop, it'll develop all of the capacities and abilities to be able to scream it at some point. It can't right now. 3-month-old babies just they can't do that kind of thing, right? They can't formulate the syllables and so on. And so they can't do it right now. But if it develops, follows the normal course of development or whatever, it will be able to. And that's a perfectly legitimate sense of potential, right? It's a different sense. A baby could potentially scream that. Okay, so we have these two senses of potential behavior. So let's consider them both then in the context of advanced mental functioning and abortion, right? So keep in mind where we are. This argument is kind of complex. We're looking for the additional trait or behavior or feature that makes a human being into a person. And at this point, George and Lee have argued it can't be some actual behavior, right? It can't be actually being self-conscious or engaging in advanced mental functioning that makes you a person. Otherwise, sleeping people wouldn't be persons or whatever. And so now we're considering, well, maybe it's some potential behavior that makes a human into a person, gives a human personhood and rights. And okay, and we found a wrinkle. That wrinkle was, well, there are two senses of potential. It's not so clear. And so we got to consider both of these senses. Oh, I meant to. Oh, well. According to George and Lee, the potential for higher mental functioning, that's also not going to do the trick for the pro-choice position. That's not going to make the pro-choice position work. Well, why not? Recall those two senses. Okay, there they are. I'm going to try to get my face out of the way. I don't know where I'll put it over here. Consider the first sense, an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, right? Because that's what we're concerned with, higher mental functioning. That's what the proponents of the pro-choice position under consideration tend to put forward. Well, so maybe maybe a proponent of that position would say that what makes you and me into persons instead of just mere human beings is that we have an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, right? So this would evade the problem that we ran into when we were considering actual advanced mental functioning. Because somebody who's asleep, they're not actually engaging in advanced mental functioning, or someone who's just zoned out, right? They're not actually engaging in advanced mental functioning. But if what makes somebody a person is the immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, well, then that's fine. Those people are still persons, right? A sleeping human being, a mature adult human being, is still a person because you just, wake them up and they can start thinking about themselves, engaging in advanced mental functioning. Yeah, they have an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, right? And you can say, although it's a little bit different, a little bit sketchier, somebody in like a reversible coma or who's momentarily unconscious, we could say that they also, and I think George and Lee would be happy to say, they also have an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, right? It might take a day or two for them to snap out of the coma or whatever, but it's still they still count as having an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning. Okay, so we evade the problem that we saw earlier. Well, so why doesn't it work? According to George and Lee, they give a series of arguments. We're going to consider two of them. They give three. One of them is just, it's not worth it to try and understand. We'll consider two. If this is what made someone a person, well, then infanticide would be morally permissible. Why? Because infants do not have an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning. It takes them time to develop. Their brains need to develop much further than they are. And so if an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning is what made us persons, is what made us, or what gave us rights, a right to life, well, then infants wouldn't be persons, wouldn't have rights, and it would therefore be permissible to kill them. Infanticide would be morally permissible. And it very clearly is not, according to George and Lee. And so this cannot be what makes us into a person. Now, this idea should hopefully strike us as somewhat similar or somewhat familiar, because it's similar, there we go, to Singer's position. We saw this idea already crop up in Singer's presentation of his own view. According to Singer, an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental function, I think Singer would likely say, yeah, that is what you need in order to be a person. And Singer would say, yeah, you're absolutely right, George and Lee. That if that's what makes someone a person, well, then infanticide would be morally permissible. It'd be permissible to kill infants. You're absolutely right, Singer would say to George and Lee. What's the difference? Singer would say, yeah, and so infanticide is morally permissible. Whereas George and Lee would say, no way. No way, right? Infanticide could, for whatever else is true, it's true that infanticide is not okay. You cannot kill a baby, right? And if Singer's position implies that it's okay to kill a baby, George and Lee would say, well, then Singer's position is wrong. That's an argument against Singer's position. If his position implies that infanticide, if any position, I think George and Lee would say, if any position implies that infanticide is morally permissible, well, then that position is wrong. It is not right. It is incorrect, because it's very clear that infanticide is not okay. How would Singer reply? Well, it is okay. George and Lee, it's not, right? At a certain point, you just get this clash, and it's unclear how to proceed beyond it, right? And we see something like that happening here, I think, between George and Lee and Singer. Yeah, that's one argument that they give. Okay, let me talk about that. Second argument. If an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning is what made a human being into a person, well, then, according to George and Lee, there would be no good justification for moral egalitarianism. There would be no good justification for according everyone equal rights and respect. Because if what makes you a person, if what gives you rights is the potential for higher mental functioning, well, then why shouldn't we give kind of greater or stronger rights to people who have greater, better abilities for higher mental functioning? Right? If higher mental functioning is this crucially important moral category that turns something that's not a being with moral standing, something that's not a person, that doesn't have rights, it turns something like that into something with rights. Well, what good reason could there possibly be for not giving greater or stronger rights to persons who can engage in higher or higher advanced mental functioning to a greater degree. The greater the degree to which you can engage in serious, rational, higher mental functioning, well, the greater the rights you should have. That would follow, George and Lee argue, if we think an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning is what makes someone a person, is what gives someone rights. Or at the very least, what they claim is there'd be no good reason for denying that more intelligent people should have greater rights. Clearly, everybody wants to deny that. George and Lee are aware of that, right? Everybody, pro-choice, pro-life, wants to deny that. Everybody wants to say, no, everybody deserves equal respect. Everybody has equal rights. But what George and Lee are claiming is that if we go this route of saying that an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning is what makes you a person and what gives you rights, if you go that route, you're not going to have any good reason at your disposal for not giving greater rights to more intelligent people. That's a problem with your view that you yourself, who put the view forward, should be able to see, and so you should abandon your view, right? It's incompatible with moral egalitarianism. That's what George and Lee claim here. That's their second argument that they give against this, right? So it can't be, according to George and Lee, an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning. That can't be what makes you a person. Okay, and as we saw earlier, it can't be some actual advanced mental functioning. Okay, well, we have one option left. Maybe it's a natural potential to develop oneself to perform higher mental functions. Maybe that's what makes a human being into a person. Having that natural potential to develop oneself in order to perform higher mental functions, right? This is that second sense of potential. And the sense, this is the second sense, a 3-month-old baby has the potential to scream, "Would you like to buy a monkey?" Yeah, it can't do it right now, but if you give it time, it'll learn language and how to make syllables and so on, and then it'll be able to. And so maybe it's the same sense of potential, but we're not talking about screaming, "Would you like to buy a monkey?" We're talking about performing higher mental functions. So what's the problem here? Is there a problem here? And George and Lee want to say, no, there's no problem here. That's great. That's fine. We agree. We think that's what makes someone a person. But that's not going to be good for the pro-choice position under consideration, because embryos and fetuses have that potential. An embryo, a single-celled embryo, has a natural potential to develop itself to perform these higher mental functions. If it's afforded the appropriate environment, if it's afforded the things it needs to develop, it'll be performing those higher mental functions. And so if we want to say that it's the second sense of potential for higher mental functionings that makes a human being into a person, well, we're going to have to say that the embryo and the fetus is a person, right? And if the embryo or fetus is admitted to be a person, well, then then we're saying they have rights, they have a right to life, and thus abortion would be impermissible. And so this avenue won't work for the pro-choice position, right? That's what George and Lee are arguing. That's their argument against the pro-choice position under consideration. Now, it's long. There are a lot of steps to it. There's a lot going on. We've gone through it now. But what I want to do is bring it all back. Let's kind of recap it. Let's put it all up there on the screen. I keep getting in the way. So there's the pro-choice position under consideration. They're arguing against it. If you hold that position, if you think that, yeah, fine, you're a physical organism, but you're not essentially a person, you only become a person at some later stage of development, well, then the crucial question is, what stage of development? What needs to be developed? What characteristic or trait or behavior do you need or need to be able to engage in order to be a person? That's the question. And the way George and Lee's argument works, well, it's either going, what trait or behavior bestows personhood and rights? It's either got to be some actual behavior, actually engaging in higher mental functioning, or it's going to be having an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functions, or it's going to be having the natural potential to develop oneself to perform higher mental functions, right? That's what they want to say. It's got to be one of those three. That's how we're going to have to answer that question. We're going to have to answer it in one of those three ways, okay? Well, we can't answer it in the first way. That doesn't work. It's not actually engaging in higher mental functions, because then sleeping people would have no rights, or people who are just zoned out, they'd have no rights. People who are in reversible comas would have no rights. And that's all false, right? People in reversible comas have rights. People who are zoned out have rights. People who are sleeping have rights. And so actually engaging in higher mental functioning is not what gives you rights. Because here we have all these people who aren't doing that, who nonetheless have rights. So they got their rights somewhere else. Yeah, that, you think of that as the way it's working. So not that. Okay, fine. It also can't be having an immediately exercisable potential for higher mental functioning, because then infanticide would be morally permissible, which it very clearly isn't, according to George and Lee. And there would be no rational justification for moral egalitarianism. There'd be no good reason for affording everybody equal rights. And that's no good, right? We need to be able to justify moral egalitarianism. So it can't be B either. Well, that leaves one option left, C. Therefore, what bestows personhood and rights? Having the natural potential to develop oneself to perform higher mental functions. And so according, and that's just Robbie George, that's not both of them. It's hard to fit both of them on there, right? So according to Robbie George there, what this shows is that abortion is morally impermissible, because if C, having the natural potential to develop oneself to perform higher mental functions, if C is what makes us persons, embryos are persons. And that's what George and Lee have thought all along. That's where they've been going all along. But that's the only viable position left, George and Lee want to say, right? These other options don't work. And so because embryos have that natural potential, embryos are persons, abortion is morally impermissible.